Okay, let's get started here. Let's bring our guest in. Emmet, can you hear me?
Good evening, Brandon. How are you?
Doing well. I can hear you very well. I can't see you though. It
No
says no
worries.
signal.
One
There we go.
second. Is that good?
There we go. Now we can see you. Perfect.
Nice. Perfect.
Nice little studio you got there.
Yes, indeed. That's one thing I do well is the old studio. Yeah. It's been a long time.
It's been a while. Yeah, it's good to hear from you, man. I kind of lost track there for a bit, but things seem to be the same now as they were then, if not worse. So
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. Even though we've both been at this for a while and we've had all these discussions, still things are quite similar, aren't they?
I think that was before the whole COVID stuff happened, the pandemic and everything. So how did
Yeah.
you take all that stuff in and respond to that over in Ireland?
Well, I thought it was at first I thought it was a joke because you know as well as I do. I mean, you were in this game longer than I was, and the thought that people would fall for that seemed a bit outlandish. Even the years before, but we were wrong. People fell for it, and at first I thought the whole thing was just kind of made up, and there was nothing actually going around. And I revised my opinion later that there was something going around, but it's just no more than the flu sort of thing. The most irritating thing about that for me was that it just kind of delayed things, you know. But yeah, it was just absolutely crazy, really.
Yeah, at the beginning, I thought it was just trumped up, the flu, but I did catch COVID myself later, but definitely blown out of proportion massively
Yeah,
in terms of like the death counts. And we know all the stories about how they exaggerated it or just calling everything COVID death when it was other causes and so on. So, but that was very much a wake up call for a lot of people. Did you notice like a paradigm shift at that moment?
well, in one sense there was, and I think a lot of people who are switched on to things knew something was up. But then again, you know, we should never be shocked by how stupid people can be. I remember once being in a there's a few crazy occasions. One time I remember being in this clinic, looking out the window, and there's a big, huge queue of people, about 20, 30 deep, queuing up to get the clot shot, you know, the magic needle. Another
Right.
time I remember walking along a canal in the Irish countryside, and somebody jogged past me with a mask on. And they were about five meters away, you know, or you might see someone driving past you in a car fucking on their own wearing a mask. So I thought people were more intelligent, but then the whole thing just reminded us that there's a lot of retards in the world still, definitely.
Yeah, there's a lot of lemmings. Not 80, 90% appear to be lemmings still. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
it was really ridiculous how people fell for that mask stuff and they were actually trying to enforce the mask stuff themselves without even, they're not police, they're not politicians, but they're like self-policing other people. Is ridiculously stupid.
Yeah.
But that's just the way people are. They get in line. So that kind of fits with the theme of your book, which is called Red Pandemic: The Global Marxist Cult. When did you write this and publish this? Very recently, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, so it was released recently, a lot later than I expected, because of the whole COVID fiasco that added an extra 2 years or whatever onto my original plan. I started doing it shortly after I was doing the podcast and we spoke. That was about 2018. And afterwards, I temporarily ran out of ideas. I did about 25 long form interviews modeled on Red Ice Radio, actually, which you were on back in the day. And after I took a break from doing those for a little bit, I wanted to do a project that would take a while, and I could also keep a low profile because I was changing careers and at the time in my day job. So I decided to keep a low profile and stay creative. And it was originally going to be a documentary, but I realized there was too much information there and too much to be said. And I thought this is looking like a book, so I just took off from there. And once I got started, I wasn't able to stop, unfortunately. And after a few hundred hours of sitting on my ass and editing and such, here we are finally.
That's great. Yeah. I have one book. It takes a lot of effort to put together a book. You need a lot of material. You need a ton of research to have a decent sized book, even just 200 pages. It takes a long time. So definitely a ton of work put into it. And you found a publisher. It says it's 640 pages, which is massive. How did you find a publisher for it?
That was tricky, and I actually only ended up with two options in the end. And one of them was an American publisher, and they offered a hybrid deal where you had to pay up front. Now, I checked them out, everything was good, but still I thought, well, in terms of being cost effective, I went with the second option, which is Omnia Veritas, who are very decent, you know, to deal with. They do a lot of, well, the more conspiratorial stuff. So I thought they can handle that. They can handle my stuff. So it worked out well in the end, I think.
Have you ever used Amazon's self-publishing platforms?
No, but I did look into that. I can't remember why I decided against it. I kind of thought, I suppose, there was no actual evidence that I was going to be stopped, but I kind of looked at it and thought, well, I didn't want to run the risk of somebody getting offended or leaving a review and say, you know, hey, he goes after trans people in the book, or he compliments Hitler or whatever. You know, I thought there's too much touchy material in there that's going to raise eyebrows, and I thought, it's not worth the risk. That was my approach.
Yeah, Amazon's pretty kosher. They, I published one of, both. I had like a book and then a second compendium of articles that I made into a book, and they banned those books completely. So.
Wow. Yeah, not worth the risk, because then it just takes your, you know, morale away and momentum almost in some ways.
Yeah, the only benefit I hear is that they'll pay you a bigger commission versus like a traditional publisher who will only pay you like 10 to 15%, and you can get like 30 to 40% on that. But there's a few other self-publishing sites out there that might be a bit better than Amazon. So let's jump into the book then. It looks fantastic from the synopsis that you sent me. I was just reading it.
Thanks.
You go through pretty much all of the stuff. So you say here, all the major destabilizing, civilization destroying issues in the world today, the various Marxist sub-agendas are driven by the same revolutionary ideology. They include mass immigration, climate change, radical sex education, feminism, abortion, BLM, anti-racism, LGBTQ, veganism, anti-Christianity, and so on. And that pretty much covers all the leftoid agendas that have accelerated over the past several years. So what's the basic rundown here of where this stuff comes from?
Well, what happened was actually, well, the COVID situation and the BLM movement really pushed me to kind of go for this. And the thing is, I suppose we were kind of talking about this earlier, you know, certain people are more awake than others and so on. Others need a bit of a push or whatever. And there's different levels of, you know, maturity and age and all these other factors, depending on how awake somebody is. But when I was looking at all the big agendas that were happening, everything that you mentioned, plus COVID and BLM as well, I kind of thought, well, they're all internationalist movements, as in they're happening everywhere. They're all revolutionary in nature. And I knew about communism, of course, before, but mostly the historical stuff and so on. But I hadn't quite joined the dots. And I thought, well, when I thought about the whole, you know, oppressor versus oppressed class struggle element in the Communist Manifesto between the rich and the poor, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, we all know, and you wrote about the Frankfurt School and so on, and cultural Marxism before. We're clued up on that stuff. And we know it's just a kind of a rehashing of the same formula. And I thought this should be obvious what's happening. This is all Marxism. And even with the BLM movement, it wasn't until the figures running the movement came out, or video came out of them saying they were Marxist, that people caught on they were Marxist. And I thought, this is bizarre here. Also, the whole COVID situation, we know it came from China, like the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That means obviously the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is involved. It's like every single agenda that was hitting us had this Marxist undertones. But yet when you look at public discourse, like it might be an audio space on X or a YouTube channel or whatever, there's very few people actually talking about it being Marxist in origin, or communist is the other term. And that kind of got me onto this. I was like, why are people not joining the dots? And then that sent me down the rabbit hole further about how the ideology is very good at repackaging itself. You know, it just sticks on a new paint job, and all of a sudden people don't recognize what it is. It really blew me away how the awareness of the subject is quite low in the general public, I think.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. It's a new paint job. So I guess the traditional Marxists were pushing mostly an economic agenda of abolishing private property and abolishing private commerce. And they still have that agenda to some degree. You've even seen like the World Economic Forum come out and say, we actually need more Marxism, and we need to abolish capitalism and create some kind of weird hybrid system where the government and maybe some big companies work together to control everything. So they're still promoting that, but then they've affixed this new race version of it, which comes out of BLM. Like you said, the leaders of BLM are Marxist, as they say, and they also attach to it the anti-family and the race agenda, right? And does that have any origins with Marxism? Because I guess Engels wrote about abolishing the family at some point too.
Yeah, and I kind of tackle that in a few different ways. First of all, I see the ideology as being like it's just has a mind of its own, and it wants to control as much as possible. Like, this is more than just about the opinions of any one group or any strain of Marxists, like a Marxist-Leninist or an anti-racist or a climate change activist. It's all really the same thing. But the ideology itself has a mind of its own, and it wants to control as much as it possibly can. So in terms of, say, controlling the family, how I see that is the ideology is a control freak in and of itself, and it doesn't like the idea that hierarchies exist, as we know. It doesn't like the idea of authoritarianism. And it doesn't like the idea of strong male figures, right? It doesn't like anything that's tough, because that can be an obstacle, and therefore that's one of the several part of the reason why it wants to control or destroy the traditional family unit. So I can't remember the other part of your question, but that addresses the family part of it anyway. Yeah.
So the oppressor versus oppressed has been transposed onto race. So it used to be just the bourgeoisie versus proletariat, which is workers versus like the business owners. They still push that, but now they've focused a little bit more on the racial angle, where they're promoting Black power or just racial minority groups as the oppressed versus the oppressor, which they peg as white people and white privilege, right? Is that how they're doing it?
Yeah, and you look at the whole European Union project, which everyone can see is failing. This multicultural utopian idea, and the EU is Marxist, of course. It's all what's enabled all of that is the idea that Europeans somehow owe Africa, right, or non-whites, based on the apparent oppression of the past. But as I explain in the book, a lot of that's based on lies. For example, the notion, the oppressor versus oppressed principle says that the oppressed class have suffered more, and the group to blame is the oppressor. And that whole what's used in the States as well, in America, what's used to justify all this anti-racist talk and all this importation of migrants is that somehow white people owe these other races because we treated them badly. But as I break down in the book, the thing that actually destroyed, well, first of all, I'll deal with the racism thing first of all, then I'll come to socialism. If you look at history, any 5-minute honest study of history will show that all races engaged in slavery towards their own kind and other races. I mean, Irish people were killing each other long before the Vikings came. The same with any other kind of ethnic groups or around the world, and the Africans even till today are killing each other and even eating each other as well, and taking slaves, and the same all other groups going way back into history, and I list them all. So the idea that the whites somehow owe them for that reason is a myth. There's also the what happened to Africa after, obviously, it used to be under control of several different European colonial powers, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Italians, and so on. And the Marxists told us that that's what's ruined that continent. But what ruined the continent was actually that Marxism entered the picture into Africa, told them all, you need to get freedom and liberation from these horrible empires. Then you had a lot of black intellectuals take control in those countries and run the country into the ground with their socialist theories. And that's what ruined Africa. But the Marxists, as we know, they're really good at turning around the historical narratives to suit their agenda. And if people don't dig into these things, then they never know. So this whole the racist thing and the race tensions and mass immigration comes from Marxism, how they distort reality and how they instill that idea of white guilt, and that somehow it's justifiable for Western countries to be destroyed or white people to be bred out of their country. Somehow that's fair according to the Marxist sense of ethics.
Right. They view it as revenge, as racial justice or a racial reckoning for slavery, colonialism. But as you pointed out, they cherry pick out only the white misdeeds, right? Only the white slavery, only the white colonialism. Go back a little bit further than all that. There's slavery in Africa. There's Ottoman Empire. There's the Moorish invasion of Spain. I mean,
Yeah.
Europe was colonized too by Mongols, by Muslims, and they never bring that up because it's not useful for their current agenda, which is to disenfranchise white people, take all their stuff, redistribute it to black people. So that seems to be the new Marxism, is redistribution of wealth, but from one race to another one.
Yeah, and you know the old phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if they have success with a particular tactic, why change the formula? They might change the groups involved or where it's applied, but it's very effective. And it's that whole the pursuit of artificial equality and so on. And as I argue in the book, they're trying to create the ideology basically destroys everything good about civilization. And it doesn't like brilliance, it doesn't like beauty, and so on. And it wants to just turn everything into a uniform, unremarkable, just, you know, cesspit basically. And that's why it needs to use the tool of equity, you know, to somehow create this situation where we're all the same, when that's not really true according to our nature. It's just a perversion of everything that's natural, basically, I think.
Yeah, that fits with what Marxism was attempting to do, which was make everybody economically equal. Economic outcomes are equalized, and everybody has the same income. But we know that that's absurd, because people have different ambition levels and different skill levels, and they should be compensated based on their effort and their skill, and not based off of just, oh, we're all one, we're all workers, so we all deserve the same thing. Now they're trying to do that with race, with gender, and extirpate identity out of people, except for the minorities. They're allowed to have identities, except for white, straight, Christian, and so on. That has to be got rid of. So like this, I have a couple of videos about this as well. You've seen like Robin DiAngelo, white privilege theory. Where does that come from? Because that is somewhat new. I guess the classical Marxists from 100 years ago weren't necessarily talking about that, but since cultural Marxism came about, Frankfurt School, you have Kimberly Crenshaw and these academics who started popularizing the white privilege, which, by the way, is complete nonsense, because as we're saying, you know, you go to jail if you're racist, but only if you're white. You know, every white country has mass immigration, which wouldn't happen if white supremacists were running the government. So it's a myth.
Yeah, the whole that I talk about, that term of privilege is really important for the Marxists to attach the concept of privilege to the oppressor, because it generates hatred. So the concept is already incendiary in and of itself. It creates conflict between the oppressed and the oppressor on the other side. But the idea of privilege is used to generate that extra hatred needed to generate conflict. And the irony of all this is, and I talk about the inverting, there's kind of an inversion theme in this ideology a lot, where they turn things upside down. The oppressor versus oppressed principle actually turns the oppressed class, it gives them the privilege. So you've seen that with, say, with the BLM movement in the States. Obviously, not everyone in America is the same. Talk about millions of people, but those black people in the States who've been taken in by the brainwashing and have gone along with this, they actually end up with a sense of privilege because it's somehow fair. And when you give any person a sense of privilege, as in your behavior is perfect the way it is, you don't need to manage your emotions at all or be civilized or anything, you watch their behavior going down the toilet. And the very same thing has happened with women because of the effect of the feminist movement. If you tell a group that they're oppressed and that they somehow are owed something by another group and they're perfect just the way they are, you watch their behavior go down the toilet and they just turn into degenerates, basically. It's the same formula used everywhere, even in Ireland now with mass immigration across Europe. Bizarre as it sounds, migrants are coming in. Not just are they coming in and that leads to all the problems, they're actually coming in with an attitude like they're owed this help. That's that privilege I was talking about. And I talk in the book about how Marxism is part of the NGO complex. It's part of the governments. It's part of the mainstream media and all aspects of society. And when it comes to mass immigration, even from before they leave their countries of origin, they're being told, brainwashed with this stuff, and are coming into Europe with an attitude. But to answer the first part of your question about, these different theories, critical race theory, and all these different concepts, you're damn right. The whole cultural Marxist thing. We could talk about the Frankfurt School, and also the effects of postmodernism as well, of where they've used logic and politicized it to generate their own sense of ethics, and they use it to attack anything they don't like, but obviously they'll never attack Marxism and so on. So again, just a big mess. And the academic circles and, classical Marxism kind of had its attempts, but then it morphed into more academic circles. And I argue in the book that's arguably more dangerous, because as we all know, the universities seem to be the primary retard factories, or the socialist indoctrination academies for this ideology. They're a major problem.
Yeah, they, as you're seeing, you're witnessing now all these major Palestine protests coming out of the universities now as well. Feminism is big there. It's a cauldron of leftist hysteria. Is the universities. That's where they indoctrinate the new generations, young generations, and they've even gone beyond universities, but public schools for children, and even small children in kindergartens are receiving anti-racist training and gender ideology studies. They have books like Anti-Racist Baby by Ibram Kendi. So they are attacking the youth with these ideas, because the youth are the most impressionable, vulnerable, who they think they can get at early to create the new generation of Marxist foot soldiers.
Yeah, spot on. And today it's actually, I think it was Noonan, one of the Irish members of Parliament, was making a speech to that effect. She was on one of the alternative media channels talking about that kind of thing, pretty much being more open about it, making kids into activists. And, obviously, and the whole Greta Thunberg thing, when she came on the scene, I predicted that she was going to be used as some sort of like the poster child for the climate change movement. And they were going to use that because that's a form of Marxism that's quite, it's not social, right? It's still based on the oppressor versus oppressed principle, because the planet's the victim, right? And we're the oppressors, apparently, right? Same formula. But it's a nice soft issue to get kids on the revolutionary bandwagon. And in Ireland, they did the same thing. And I put this in the book as well. They organized climate strikes. So even in the name, it's got that trade union movement vibe to it. We have these kids being given the day off school to go and march in the street like fucking idiots, as we say in Ireland, or idiots, right? Marching down the streets, brainwashed with this. And as I talk about in the book, this is extremely dangerous. This is like the Soviet era stuff, but for the modern age, where they're getting kids at younger ages. It used to be traditionally the universities, but as you pointed out, high school, secondary school, now they're going after the kids with the climate change movement, pushing the whole rape culture stuff and the trans ideology, because they know full well, and I talk about this in the book, that, kids may never recover from this indoctrination. They're literally gone as a person. That's the tragedy of the situation. And I'm always arguing that people are always trying to look for the political solution out of this and the different solutions. I'm like, this is an ideological warfare. And if people think it's bad now with all the crazy nut jobs in society, wait a few years when all these kids start coming through university, we're going to be overwhelmed. People like us we're going to be considered crazy because we're not part of the cult. So I think that in terms of the indoctrination battle, particularly in terms of getting in control of who's influencing the young, is a big one. And towards the book, I mentioned, I offer some advice to parents, and the book is one of the target groups of the book is parents, because kids are essentially the future in this struggle,
Exactly. The education system is pretty much the main focus of this cult, infiltrating it, co-opting it. You saw the major teachers unions in America, UK, Canada are pushing critical race theory. They're promoting equity and racial diversity in the workforce. And governments have adopted actual legislation that discriminates against white men in the workforce. This is clear. There was a report that came out about a few months ago saying 94% of new hires at all the major companies in the U.S. in 2021 were people of color. And this was part of the BLM push, right? We're making promises to people of color. So they're actively discriminating against white people to elevate non-white people. And yet they are wagging their fingers at us saying, you have the privilege. We have the privilege of being discriminated against, of being ethnically replaced and attacked and demonized. It's absurd. I just wanted to pull this video up about Ireland. So this is a clip
it's true
of
that
these are Irish politicians talking about pretty much the same Marxist spiel here. Let's go
Irish
for
have
it.
known a fair share of oppression. The reality is, during that oppression, we still maintained our invisibility cloak of white privilege.
And we often hear about white privilege, and it hadn't really occurred to me that I had white privilege as well. But now, listening to you, I understand that I do have a privilege.
I think we shouldn't forget that our Parliament still looks very male, very stale and pale.
Of course you can say that. You're a middle-class white man.
Stale and pale. Male, stale and pale. That sounds like dehumanizing language there.
Yep, super racist and traitors as well. How could we forget? Traitors to their own kind. And as you know, you can tell straight away from the language they're using, it's all Marxist talk, oppression, talking about race, talking about privilege, classic Marxism. And I'd like to point out as well that, like, by the way, for those who don't know, the viewers, the Irish political system is full of Marxists. It doesn't matter what they call themselves. They're out. Sinn Féin is there. We can talk about them if you want to, but it's full of cult members, the Irish government. Yeah, full of them.
So you view the law completely different to somebody who is a traveller, to somebody who is uneducated, to somebody who's maybe a member of the Roma community. So it is very, very different. You know that the law doesn't treat you the same. It doesn't treat you the same.
You, as a white privileged man, how does my debt impact your life?
I think it's worth putting on the record of this House that concept of white privilege and how that can be normatised in our own lives. And, you know, we as we develop as a society and a more racially integrated society, I think need to become more and more conscious of that within our own politics and the advantage that has brought, but the corollary being that your whiteness is itself an advantage, and to really understand that.
I often observe young people as they walk together. One of their party or two of their party will be from, you know, their background maybe from a different country, and they are, you know, celebrating that and they are engaged in that much more so than the very dull, white, pasty Ireland that I grew up in. I think what we need to do in our own political system is to call out the hypocrisy of standing in a parliament like this, full of white people, and saying as racism is something that other people do, because it's what politicians here in Ireland.
And yet that's what he's doing right there. So this is incredible, because the level of infiltration, these are multiple politicians across multiple parties spouting the same gibberish about white privilege. And they're reading from a script, it seems. This is like the Robin DiAngelo, you know, white fragility handbook.
Yeah, and for people who weren't very in touch with what's happening in Ireland, I think I often have arguments with my friends from around the world, Canada, Australia, and so on. We're always arguing who has the most fucked up country, and I'm saying no, it's Ireland. It has to be Ireland. It has to be one of the worst. And the treason in Ireland knows no bounds. And when you look at all these idiots talking here, what we were just talking about, they've all come through the education system as well. A lot of them have done their sociology and political science degrees or whatever it is, the humanities. They're all brainwashed. And the thing is, unfortunately, what Marxism does as well, it hides behind, you know, very thin layers of disguise. So a lot of Irish people, I mean, a lot of these mainstream parties and so on, you've got Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, Social Democrats, Labour Party, they've all been outed as being treasonous and so on. But I think for some people, that veneer that they're all different is somehow works, that they're alternatives. But in terms of their behavior and their attitudes, they're all pro-globalists, they're all Marxists in their origins, and you can see them all there. They all deserve to be arrested straight away. But unfortunately, there is no opposition to Marxism in the Irish government. It's all one.
So where does this Marxism come from in Ireland? Because I noticed that there was this trend in that country where you see a lot of sympathy for Palestine and a sympathy for third world struggles and this seems to be tied in with the fight against the English, the anti-colonial struggle, and it seems like some kind of Maoism penetrated into Ireland and became kind of the mainstream thinking in Ireland, that like we were oppressed by the English, so our friends are all of the brown people of the world. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there is a lot of Palestinian protests, and I put them in videos myself. And obviously, students and the political left parties are involved in pushing this, and they're always trying to play that card and try to gaslight ordinary Irish people who aren't brainwashed and say, "Don't you feel solidarity with the Palestinians because they're being oppressed and we're being oppressed?" Same formula again, oppressor and oppressed. And as I talk about in the book, Marxism is really part of the furniture in Ireland. It goes way back. I mean, you had like the French Revolution was 1789 to 1799, thereabouts. You had the United Irishman Rebellion and one of the Irish patriotic crowd called Wolfe Tone, who was kind of one of the major figures of that period. So since then, all the way up till the present day, there's been the Irish history and the history of Marxism had a lot of points that match. So the October Revolution the 1917. The two revolutions in Russia in 1917 happened the year after the 1916 Rising in Ireland. Now, there was a lot of good men involved and so on, but there was undoubtedly a Marxist element to that because it's revolution against the empire. And I predict that that's going to be a struggle for a lot of Irish people to get their heads around. We need to be nationalistic and sovereign, but get away from the Marxist thing. And Marxism had people like James Connolly and Jim Larkin were people who were involved with the socialist movements in Ireland in the late 19th century, who kind of became figures going forward and became revered. Then you had everything with the after World War One, the formation of the Irish the Republic and so on, and even everything in Northern Ireland as well. All of that happened because of Marxism. You know, that was what the incendiary factor. So Marxism is woven right in with Irish culture, and it's not going to be easy to get it out.
Yeah, it seems like the Marxists hijacked anti-colonialism. This became the rallying cry for all the African countries. They all became Marxist socialists, allied to the Soviet Union,
exactly,
in order to stop the evil colonialists. And it's a similar phenomenon in Ireland. A lot of the initial anti-colonial types were Marxists and got sucked into Marxism and Maoism in particular, and that's why they're into the whole Palestine thing, and it's become a big rallying cry for the Irish left and the left everywhere, as you're seeing.
Yeah, as I argue in the book, I think that Marxism, the way I see it, looking at things from a global perspective, Marxism is a new type of imperialism, and as the world is going to find out, it's the worst form of imperialism ever, without any competition at all. It's just a different type of imperialism. So all that happened to Ireland was it went from being under the control of an imperial power into getting its independence, kind of ish on paper for a few decades, arguably. But we did have a British monarch until the early 50s on paper, which is quite even in the Republic, which is quite interesting because that was when you had we know about Kalergi, and your viewers know about Kalergi. The pan-European movement started in the 20s, but you had the Treaty of Rome in the early 50s. You had the European it was a coal and steel federation in the early 50s. It developed into the European Economic Community, which Ireland joined in 1973. So my point here is that Ireland has never really been sovereign. It's never really been free at all. It was under the control of the British Crown, kind of had its independence on paper, and then started to join the Marxist empire slowly. And then obviously when you had the Lisbon Treaty and the Maastricht Treaty and so on, those kind of things lock the member states in to the European Union entity, which is itself Marxist. So you're dead right. And speaking of other continents quickly, that's all that happened with Africa in the 20th century. It went from being under the control of European colonial powers into being joining the international Marxist cult and all of that brought. And this is one of the tragedies of the situation. The Marxists seem to have a monopoly on talking about imperialism and oppression, because they are the worst impressionists we've ever had.
Yeah, and I noticed that they're raging hypocrites when they talk about imperialism, because they're only against one type of imperialism, and that's when it's done by a white country, right? If it's done by an Islamic country, they don't talk about it. If it's done by China, they won't talk about it. The Chinese actions against Uyghurs and such, they never critique that. If it's Russia invading Ukraine, they won't really criticize that because they think, oh, well, they're aligned against the West, so that's good. So it seems like it's only if it's a Western European or America or Canada country, NATO country, then it's bad imperialism. But if it's one of our guys, then it's good imperialism.
Yeah. And even in South America, when you had all the chaos that happened there, and America was trying to protect its interests, and you had obviously a lot of the right-wing governments in South America with Operation Condor and so on, they needed to protect themselves from what was happening. And sorry, I forgot where I was going with that. But the
Americans in South America.
Yeah, so the same formula again, just about the double standard. Sorry, Yuri Bezmenov talked about how a lot of the intellectuals in the States didn't mind when you had the Russians getting involved in the affairs of South American countries, but all of a sudden when the Americans did it, that was a problem. And we see the same pattern in Africa as well in the 20th century, this bias towards the Western powers. I think a lot of it, again, because it's such a big mess of the ideology, a lot of it comes from Lenin's work as well. I think he wrote that a pamphlet about imperialism is the highest state of capitalism. I think I got the title wrong, but basically, there is a tremendous bias here towards Western countries, and on a geopolitical level, we can see here today where, again, the double standards, right? Like you were saying, there's no criticism of China and what they're up to, and authoritarianism and control of the population and all these infringement upon rights because it's run by a communist party. Whereas if you look at Western countries, the Marxists talk about freedom of speech and humanitarianism and so on. That double standard has been a feature all through the history of the cult.
Despite the cult controlling these governments, or at least having influence within these governments, it's like all these Western governments are run by people who are aligned with various Marxist precepts and ideology, and yet they still only attack Western countries when it comes to foreign policy. Right? They'll never critique any other country in the global South for their genocides, the genocides that happened in Africa, the stuff going on in the Middle East, Islamic radicalism, or Russian imperialism. In fact, people like Jackson Hinkle, I don't know if you've seen this guy on Twitter, he's just a rabid shill for any government that is aligned against the West, and they're openly cheering for BRICS and for the downfall of Western economies. And everything that they do is simply designed to amplify and empower the global South. And they view Russia as becoming part of that now because they're aligning more with China and Islamic countries in Africa against the West. So it's just designed to take down the West. It's just a revenge thing from what I see. Yeah.
And I mean, you're right to identify that it is incredibly biased and so on. And I put that down to, I've pondered it myself, how this actually works. And I think it's because, again, the ideology just seems to be hell-bent on destroying everything that's good. And that's where that destructive tendencies come from. And then the racial element too as well. And to get into the more ethnic stuff, I suppose, there's also the idea that a lot of the civilization tends to be across the West. And there's also the Christian element as well. There's Western countries have been primarily Caucasian, or at least kind of run or organized by Caucasians, as well as being Christian in nature, and the ideology, and also capitalistic. So the ideology is opposed to those things. It's opposed to civilization. It's opposed to the white race. It's opposed to Christianity. And it just seems to gravitate towards destroying those types of things, which is, that in part explains why they've got this bias towards Western countries.
100%. So this is a clip from George Galloway. I'm sure you've heard of this guy.
This is George Galloway, your Member of Parliament for the last 3 months or so.
Islamic Member of Parliament.
For a 5-year
He's got
term to finish
the Palestine colors on his banner, of course.
What we achieved in just 54 parliamentary days, you wonder what your last 4 MPs were doing for the last 15 years.
Fully flanked by Mohammed and Ahmed. Seems like that's the main people who are voting for him, right?
Oh, this alliance always makes me laugh. The whole Islamo-communism thing. The cult members have no idea what they're inviting in, and they're going to be eaten by this wave like everybody else.
Yeah, it seems like Galloway, whenever he runs for public office, he runs almost exclusively on campaigning for Gaza or campaigning for Palestine. Like he doesn't care about the English people, the British people, anyone in the UK. He cares only about foreigners and their interests, because that's who vote for him, is a bunch of Muslims who only care about Muslim issues, right?
Yeah. Sorry, not America. The United Kingdom is full of cult members. It's an extremely rotten place. Plenty of decent people there as well who've got a patriotic or nationalistic outlook. But the amount of cult members there is off the charts. And that guy, as you pointed out there, he's always going to be guaranteed a certain percentage of the vote because he appeals to the sensibilities of cult members. And as we all know, they're always more preoccupied with the well-being of people outside their own countries. And that's part of the damaging effect of the ideology. If you have everybody more concerned what's happening outside their own borders, by definition, that's not efficient, and it results in the breakdown of civilization. Again, just a big mess, really.
It's part of the hierarchy of victims that they project, right? The brown or the global South, the black and brown people of the world, they're put up on the pedestal as the ultimate victims of history. And so the cult tells them, you cannot look after your own first. That would be racist. So you have to look out for them first because they're more downtrodden than you. Even though obviously there's white people who are poor or homeless that they don't care about. So it really is just an anti-white death cult at the end of the day. And it's aligning itself with Islam because they see Muslims as this new immigrant group that are amenable to left-wing messages, right? Socialism, welfarism, anti-racism, all that plays very, very well with people who are not white and are immigrants.
Yeah, and the whole to address the first thing you mentioned about pathological altruism, that's a major problem with the ideology where people are brainwashed to think that we somehow can be the saviors, even though when you look at a country like Ireland, the whole population now must be, I think, over 7 million for the whole island, or a bit more than that. And you look at the population of sub-Saharan countries like Nigeria is up over 200 million or whatever. So, I mean, the notion that we can just continuously help people, I don't know if you saw the videos, but now there's migrants being shipped in to be put in tents, like camping tents. They're in tents along the canals and in Dublin City on the streets. This is ludicrous.
Hotels too, right?
Yeah. So the hotels are all kind of filling up, and they've been building temporary accommodation sites around the country. So a good protests trying to fight back against that. But literally, the migrants are being put in tents, like camping tents in the city on the streets. So this is Orwellian nightmare stuff, you know. And back to what you were saying earlier about the pandering to the migrants and so on is a big issue, and we're dealing with this in Ireland, where you're always going to get the political left, the Marxist cult members in Ireland. It's very easy for them to get migrants or people from less civilized parts of the world to go along with them, and they'll pander to each other and say, we're going to help you. They'll have a little alliance, and they'll bring them into the country and help them integrate, quote unquote, and even get them into politics, as we saw in Ireland as well. So, you know, there's a whole, there's these unusual alliances going on here, but there's a certain amount of symbiosis going on that benefits both sides.
Yeah, it's a coalition of the degenerates. There's a funny meme that has all this horde of freaks. You know, we got the trans, LGBT, drug addicts, BLM, and then you have the puppet masters guiding them. So that seems to be what this is. It's the underclass kind of teaming up together against the white man, and they're being manipulated and duped, but they actually believe in this cult. So one thing I wanted to ask you about was this anti-immigration stuff happening in Ireland, because there's been quite a few protests and some big things happening there. So what's going on with that?
Well, the latest development is that the Irish Parliament is voting at the moment, or there was going to be a vote this week, I believe, on the European Migration Pact. Another, piece of jargon by the clergyites in Brussels, to solidify their plans, basically making it member states like Ireland obliged to bring in more and more migrants, and putting us in a position diplomatically where it's harder to refuse the agenda, pretty much. Now, to my knowledge, that's been delayed till a later date, apparently, but I have to look into that again. So the opposition is building, and there's several sites around Ireland where they're shipping in these migrants, these temporary accommodation situations. You mentioned the hotels and so on. But as I noticed, the regime seems to be, they're trying out new tactics all the time. And they've been using money to pay business owners and hotel owners, as far as I know, to kind of go along with this. So there's a lot of money changing hands as well. Obviously, the government is dishing a lot of resources into this. And there is a growing opposition. It hasn't really become violent yet, but has gotten a little bit physical. And obviously the state is using the police force as like a thugs unit, pretty much, and the public order unit are showing up to kind of force this on people. It's really sad to see. And maybe, again, I hate to be dramatic about it, but it lends a bit of weight to the idea that the only thing that's going to work, and the only thing that's going to work in a sense, is force. Because when you're dealing with a bunch of these fundamentalist ideologues within the system, they're obviously not going to give up without a fight. So my prediction is that things are going to get a bit nasty. I just don't know when that's going to happen. But it's a real mess, and the migrant waves don't really seem to be stopping. The government, as far as I know, with people like Helen McEntee and Simon Harris and the different mouthpieces involved, they've been kind of putting out these vibes recently, as far as I know, where they say they're going to, they seem like they're attempting to gain control of the situation. But I just think that's a maneuver just to take some of the heat off them, I think. There's also been a few politicians that have stepped down recently, which is another sign that the system is trying to, make people calm down a little bit. But I don't really think it's going to work. I think people are severely pissed off at this point.
Yeah, you saw some pretty big, almost riots type stuff going on in Dublin a few months ago. And things are really kicking off there as far as migration. I would say is probably a good percentage of the population, maybe even the majority now, that is fed up with this crap, right? It's fed up with uncontrolled immigration, cultural Marxism in the schools. All this stuff is coming to a head. They've pushed it too far. And so people are getting...
Look at this, boys. I got on the bus.
Noticed
every single fucking one of them. All weird and black. All of them from fucking wherever. Every single fucking one of them. What the fuck is going on?
So that looks very similar to places like Canada, Toronto. You can see scenes like that. There's videos of that where everybody on the bus is Indian, everybody on the metro is Pakistani. This is a great replacement, what it looks like to me.
Yeah, I wonder how people feel about that, the contrast, because I remember getting those buses when I was a kid, and they obviously didn't look like that. And I have been on a bus in Ireland in a long time, but that would certainly remind me of, say, being in London, where I lived for years, right? So I think it's interesting that Ireland it's almost like, I don't want to go down this conspiratorial road, but it's almost like the top heads in the UN or the European Union looked at Ireland and thought, well, geographically, it's a little island in the edge of Europe, right? It's out there on its own. We need to make it catch up with everywhere else. And it's almost like they hit the fast forward button and start to ship them all in. And it's amazing how they've done it as well, because, the boat people thing doesn't really happen in Ireland, right? Say if you're in Italy or Spain or whatever, or maybe in the south coast of France, you'll have the boat people issue, coming into the south of Spain or coming into Sicily or whatever, or the coast of Italy. But Ireland doesn't really have the boat problem, but they ship them in by plane. So they've managed to do it. They've managed to ship them all in. And obviously with UK, the UK is the boat problem people as well. And you've also got the Channel Tunnel, but Ireland doesn't have that, and they've still managed to pull it off. And it's quite interesting how they've spread them out all around the country. And my little theory on that is, they've put them into these little towns all over the country as well as everywhere else to spread out the numbers a bit, so it doesn't look so obvious what's happening, to kind of delay that effect of the Irish people going, shit, this is getting out of hand here. And unfortunately, what's happening now is people are starting to realize that the only way out of this is going to be having some sort of probably a physical response, though a lot of people are in denial about that. But now you've got the problem of you've got the political left in collusion with the state and the police force, as well as the migrants, many of the migrants who aren't going to want to be, you know, they're not going to want to stop what they're doing. So the Irish are in a real, we're in a real serious position here, an existential crisis. And it's you know, unless there's something big happens to turn things around, it's not looking good.
Yeah, and so to keep a lid on all the anti-globalist sentiment, anti-leftist sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment, they have to brutalize the population with hate speech laws. And you've seen they've used these in Canada, in Ireland, in Scotland, in the UK. They're brutal laws where they arrest people for misgendering transgenders on Twitter, and they're kicking people's doors down over nonsense. Just ridiculous stuff that nobody would ever think twice about, you know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that this stuff was acceptable criticism. And now you can't say boo against minorities of any type, but you can, of course, do the inverse thing where you can attack whites. You could attack Christians, whites, the indigenous people of Europe, and they're fair game, right? You could blanketly say all white people are racist, and you're not going to be arrested. You're not going to be charged with hate speech because the law is completely biased against white people. It's just what it is. Another one of our white privileges is that we can't criticize any other group, but we can be criticized.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I mean, if it wasn't obvious before, what's afoot here should be obvious when you have the state literally controlling what people say, any sort of dissent at the ground level. I talk about this in the book that, and this is part of the softening feminization that's happened in the West, that it has made people so timid. And it's even convinced some people that you shouldn't get angry about things. You know, the feminist movement has helped towards that. And when men aren't allowed to be aggressive, the whole toxic masculinity thing, the New Age movement has contributed towards that as well, which I put in the book. The attack on masculinity in general, veganism, you name it, and hate speech laws. They've all what they all do is they stop people getting angry, which is a very important self-defense tool to have, whether as an individual or a nation, is to lose your fucking temper. So if people can't vocalize their anger, it can't generate that energy required to have a rebellion. That's my theory as to why they're doing it. Now, in terms of what the government is doing, or sorry, that's my theory as to how it fits into the bigger picture. But in terms of the government, they were kind of talking about trying to bring in hate speech, and I'm not sure what the status is at the moment. It needs to go through the different steps of legislation and so on. But I don't think they're brazen enough to try that. If there was to be a point where there's going to be a flashpoint, that might be it. If they try to impose this stuff on people, apparently some of there Leo Varadkar, the outgoing the gay Indian Taoiseach, he was talking about these hate speech laws and saying that, you know, they were necessary after the riots they had in Dublin and so on. And they're talking about, you know, going into people's houses, confiscating their computers and laptops and phones, and you're obliged by law to provide passwords and so on. You know, so this is real 1984 stuff, and who would have thought they were ever going to try to bring this in? But here we are.
Yeah, it's a reboot of the Soviet Union. This is a Stalinist gulag. The head of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, who's Muslim, he was pushing a hardcore hate speech law. I think they got it passed in Scotland, and then people started denouncing him. That was funny. They were denouncing him because of a speech he gave where he was attacking white people. So there's too many white people in the parliament, all this stuff. So it's just insane hypocrisy. It's basically clown world, right? So these politicians, they're anti-white. They're in the Marxist cult. They're spewing this stuff in the parliament. And yet they're trying to create hate speech laws that are applied exclusively against people who criticize them and criticize their hatred of whites and their agendas against whites. That's what it is.
Yeah, that racial, I wonder how much of it, it's not a surprise to people like us because we've been contemplating this stuff for years. I wonder how much of a shock this is to the average person in the street, whatever that means, because I know everybody's different, but I wonder how they feel about that. There's clearly, when you join all the dots of all the different Marxist agendas, whether it's the hate speech laws, as you said, the feminist movement, what it's done to the birth rates and so on, the BLM movement, which clearly had an anti-white element, the mass immigration issue, all of the Marxist sub-agendas, even the ones that are a little bit, seem a bit soft, like the veganism issue, like I said, which affects sterility and birth rates. They all have that. They're all happening in primarily Western countries. And I talk about this in the West and the book, that there's eugenics theme as well running through all of these Marxist movements, from, the Fabian socialists when they founded in 1884, through to what happened with the genocidal regimes in the 20th century, through to the trans movement of today. There's this eugenics undertone where, and even the feminist movement as well, they all produce the same results. That is an anti-white formula being played out here, an agenda, but also an agenda to wipe out dissent, wipe out the kind of, to remove people from society who might resist the international globalist Marxist system. That's the effects of all this these eugenics and so on. And obviously the free speech laws, I don't see these, I see these as the symptoms of the problem of the internationalist ideology of globalist ideology of Marxism. These are just symptoms. The hate speech laws are just there to stop any sort of rebellious energy from developing, to stop all this, really.
Yeah, they've had the hate speech laws for a long time. Like in Canada, they've had them for 30 years, and they're just outrageously authoritarian. I mean, like they were arresting people years ago for making racist jokes on the internet, and it's basically clown world at this point, where we have open hatred of white people allowed to happen in the universities and the media. BLM leaders are calling for looting and saying that's reparations for slavery. And all the politicians in the media are coddling these radicals, right? They're promoting them. This is racial justice. You deserve it for all those years of oppression. And this is the social justice crusade, is essentially taking white people out of the workforce with equity laws, and taking white people out of the government because, you don't reflect the population anymore, so we have to bring in Black and brown people to represent you. So it's all gearing towards the same thing, which is the extinction of Europe, extinction of Western civilization. So one other thing is, you mentioned Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals, in your book. Now, what was his ideology really? He gets mentioned a lot when it comes to Marxism. So what does he advocate for in that book?
Well, actually, I was debating whether or not to include that in the book, because I thought I was trying to make the book nice and palatable to the average person, whatever that means, as best I can. And I was wondering whether or not to go into the historical stuff so much, but I think he is a significant figure, because he showed very clearly, when you look at the civil service types, or the community organizer types we have today. Ireland's full of them, and the NGO complex, and also other organizations. I know in the States you call them non-profits, we call them non-governmental organizations. All of these movements, Saul Alinsky was the kind of person who developed the tactics that they use in terms of protesting, where you to cause disruption and promote Marxism and promote Marxist causes, walking the line between what's legal and illegal. And, just so they don't get stopped. And obviously groups like Antifa and so on were inspired by him as well. But he was basically a Jewish Marxist agitator, quote unquote, who operated in the it was like in the 40s to 60s, thereabouts. He was operating. He brought out 2 books, Revelli for Radicals and Rules for Radicals, was his famous, I think, 1971 work. And what he did was he went into disadvantaged communities. He started work in Chicago, which is a real cesspit for Marxism nowadays. Mr. Obama came from there, not his real name, but he came from the Alinsky training method, basically. Obama did, but Alinsky, what he did was he went into these disadvantaged communities to help the people. And he went in there and generated discontent. And that's typical Marxists, where they find reasons for people to complain or to feel disgruntled and politicize it. generate energy, generate revolutionary energy, and tell them that they're oppressed. And it's a very clever agenda, because we were talking about the education system and so on, and we hinted at things like affirmative action and equity and so on. Back in those days, the Marxists had to find ways of reaching people who weren't able to go to college. So community organizers were a good way of infiltrating into these poor, disadvantaged areas and get to people and brainwash them. And I put the blame for BLM on the shoulders of that piece of trash, Alinsky, who was a brazen Marxist. And I mean, in the book as well, I mean, that book is evil, Rules for Radicals. And it's actually quite popular among the university students of today. We talked about the universities. Where are they getting their ideas from? People like Alinsky, who told them how that, to not listen to other people, terrorize other people till you get what you want, get out there and be part of the revolution and so on. He's a real piece of work, that guy, and I'm glad I left him in the book.
Didn't he advocate for like slander and all kinds of like rumor mongering to discredit opponents and stuff like that?
Yeah. So he got his 12 rules, and I'm struggling to remember them off the top of my head, but you can actually see them being played out here today, where he talks about isolating targets, picking people, demoralizing them. He talks about keeping the pressure on. He talks about not having a conscience, right? Other people are going to tell you that what you're doing is wrong and there's such a thing as right and wrong and so on. And so he advocated that kind of activism, and it was brutal, as to demoralize the enemy, he called it. And interestingly as well, in that book, he said himself, he's a really good example of how the ideology repackages itself, because he said that he used terms like haves and have-nots. So it's the whole bourgeoisie proletariat thing again, the rich and the poor under a different name. And so he advocated for this type of stuff. And the thing is, he operated in the area after McCarthyism as well, pretty much. He kind of said himself, he was active during the area of McCarthyism, which is the Americans doing their best to purge the country of the Marxist cult members. He operated after that, but he shows how they're clever enough to change their names and not call themselves Marxists to evade detection as best as possible. And unfortunately, this is the story of Marxism. When he marched into those communities to brainwash these people, like black people and so on, in Chicago and in New York or wherever he was operating, the fact that you don't advertise yourself as a Marxist is enough to keep you safe. And you can just have this benevolent, charitable veneer on the outside. And that's enough to convince people that you're there to help, which isn't true at all. It's the exact opposite.
Yeah, Obama came out of those circles with Chicago. There was a radical communist he was tied in with. I forget his name. Do you remember he was involved with the Weather Underground?
In Chicago, was it?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think now.
There was a guy, his name will come to me, but he was part of the Weather Underground. There was another member of the Weather Underground, Susan Rosenberg, that became involved with Black Lives Matter. She was helping organize the funding for Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
So a lot of those 70s radicals,
I think.
Yeah, they came out and pretty much started to support and promote and organize the BLM movement as essentially an offshoot of their own cause. The guy called Eric Mann, he was like a labor union activist. He was the mentor for Patrisse Cullors, who was the founder of BLM. Mm-hmm. So pretty much that whole labor union movement out of Chicago area has their hands all over this thing.
Yeah, and it's you look at
years.
Yeah, and what's the name of that president? Or not president? Sorry, the mayor of Chicago. Is he still going? Is it Brandon Johnson or something? I think. He's a Marxist as well, and that place has been a cesspit for that for years. But back to what you said, that notion of these cult members telling people that they're victims based on their socio-economic group or their race or whatever it is absolute poison. And that's the seed that grows. You're always going to find people in groups who feel disenfranchised or oppressed for some reason. And the ideology is very good at weaponizing that disenfranchisement. And that's where the BLM movement came from. And you mentioned Susan Rosenberg. She gets a mention in the book as well. I think she was involved with I think it's a Thousand Currents organization who was kind of funding BLM. And again, the whole Jewish activist background there as well, that common thread as well. So, you know, these fires were lit a long time ago, and now America is starting to, it's really under pressure here to deal with this. America is in a critical condition because of the seeds that were planted such a long time ago. And even I mentioned Kent Clisby, who was a CIA field officer who brought out a book called Willing Accomplices, talking about Soviet subversion in the States as far back as the 20s. So it's a mistake to say it was only the last few decades. This thing is way, way older. And that's a mistake a lot of people make in general discourse. They think it was, you know, the hippie movement, and, you know, they'll only go as far as that. But as people like us know, the origin does go way, way further back than that.
And it's usually similar characters that they follow the trends and they're still involved behind the scenes. They just don't take front page role. Like Eric Mann, very few people heard of him, but he was super involved with promoting BLM and creating BLM. Rosenberg and a lot of these people. And they're all communists, it seems like. But it's funny because like the communists support it, but then you have like these mega corporations who also support the same Marxists, even though the Marxists want to like take away their property. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it seems to make it. Yeah, it seems to be a contradiction, and that would throw, not people like us, but that would throw some people off, and they would say, well, it's not communism then because rich people can't be communists. But that's not true. Right. And as people like us know, the whole Champagne socialist thing goes right back in history as well. The Fabian Society were the first ones to start that in 1884. They were a bunch of well-to-do types, the Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Hubert Pierce and Blanche, and then later G.B. Shaw, George Bernard Shaw. They were well-to-do types, but their kind of communism was about not attacking the bourgeoisie, but using revolution, but using reformism to transform the society in line with communist principles. So that goes way back. And I think as well, that is a theme that continued throughout the history of communism in the States as well, where you had rich people getting on board with this ideology that apparently wants to go after the rich. But as we know, this actually, as G.B. Shaw himself said, it was the sons of the bourgeoisie that painted the flag red. This ideology has a bourgeoisie undertone to it. And one of the common theories is that this ideology comes from the elites itself as a way of taking out the middle class. Because what it's doing is it's destroying wealth, but not the elites. Whatever they are, and it just creates a proletariat working class mass of people in order to protect their own financial interests. Now, I don't like putting that one out there because it tends to feed back into Marxist brainwashing again, and people start saying it's all about the rich and money, which isn't really true, but I think it's all connected.
Yeah, it seems like there are these champagne socialists. You've seen these Marxist streamers now. They're on Twitch and they're millionaires, yet they're Marxists at the same time, and they're buying fancy cars. But this is the case with all socialists. If you notice that as soon as they get a taste of the good life, they really stop living as a socialist. They may spout the socialism ideologically, but they live as a capitalist. They live as someone who wants the good life. And you've seen that in Spain. There's these famous Spanish politicians, outright Marxists, yet they bought a nice big mansion in the suburbs of Madrid. They got nice cars. Now the guy owns a business now. So this tends to be the case. You've seen like Kim Jong-un lives fairly well. He's a big fat guy.
Yeah, that spoiled brat, yeah.
Yeah, Maduro, Chavez, these guys live very, very well. This is the contradiction of socialism itself, is that once these guys get into power, they want to live the good life. They want to take advantage of power to enrich themselves, and they just keep it under wraps a little bit, right? Under the covers. It's not official. Officially, there's no millionaires in the Soviet Union, but the elites were living fairly well. They were able to get access to goods that the workers weren't. But yeah, I think the paradox there that these big companies are supporting outright Marxist. You know, there's multiple motivations for doing that. Probably some of it is they want to do virtue signaling and PR to make it seem like they care about social justice and they don't just care about money or something. Another thing, I think they started to throw money at them as a means to try to calm them down or something. It was like, you know, they were looting and rioting and burning down a lot of banks and stuff, and big companies were getting hit. And they're like, oh, if we just give them money, then they'll stop rioting or something like that. And there's that motive. And then there's some actual ideological motivations here, because it doesn't totally make sense that they would be promoting a lot of this stuff that goes against their bottom line, that goes against their interests, like Gillette promoting feminism, like, you know, that commercial, Bud Light promoting transgenderism, which cost them billions of dollars after a boycott. So it seems like there's some kind of infiltration that's happened of major companies as well. And there's ideologically motivated people at the top there in the boardrooms that are promoting social agendas that don't really have to relate to business, but they're just using the business and the power of that business to push a social agenda.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what's so dangerous about this ideology, Brandon, is that it's mutated so much. So we were talking about, is there kind of a contradiction between the tenets of socialism and the rich versus the poor, and the fact that a lot of the rich support this ideology? Well, that would only apply if Marxism only had one mutation or one form, but now it's mutated into all these other forms, and now the old rules don't apply, which is why I advocate that we have to train as many people as possible by educating them about this issue into understanding the ideology from a holistic point of view, rather than looking at it just from a socialist point of view with the rich versus the poor thing. The whole the cultural Marxist, so-called cultural Marxist side of it, I think, is a lot more dangerous than the original form, because it's a bit more, it can be a little bit more nebulous and has many more different applications. And as for the whole thing of the corporate world using that, this thing is, you know, this is so widespread now at this stage, and it has co-opted so much and is in control of so much. And I'm delighted to see that people are starting to wise up to this woke, they call it woke stuff, by boycotting companies. That's how they should be dealt with. You know, any sort of companies are promoting this ideology, which is going to destroy the West, including the corporate world and so on. We should use you know, financial boycotts to kind of punish them for what they're doing, to stamp this stuff out.
Well, you've seen the long march through the institutions, meaning the universities, but there's actually also been simultaneously a long march through the businesses. And so the Wall Street, the big tech companies have been colonized by people with an ideological agenda. They're recruiting these people out of universities. All the CEOs and these higher ups in these companies are coming out of these same universities, and they have social agendas that they put above economics, or whatever it is, the business motivation. So this clip here is from Disney. They got an undercover video of a guy from Disney.
I would say a relatively large percentage of our top writer creators happen to be women, and a lot of
just by happenstance.
I mean, like, just like if you say whatever, I don't know, whatever 10 or 15% of the population is gay, I would guess that 30 to 35% of our top writers happen to be, you know, gay. And so I think a lot of them lean into trans stories more than your average straight writer would.
So that very much explains a lot of this stuff coming out of Veritas, confirms everything we've believed. A lot of these people in these big institutions and government are admitting a lot of the stuff that we've been saying for years. So 30%, he's saying, of the top writers and creators at Disney are gay themselves, and that's why they're pushing this social ideological agenda into the films.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is a very important part of the whole process, where the ideology uses people to further itself and to proliferate the cult. So that's why you're going to see more and more people from these oppressed groups in different positions of power, in the media, in the government. We've all seen it. And also women as well, particularly feminist women, of course, are going to be put into all these influential positions because they're more likely to push those agendas out onto the population. Of course, it all links in with the feminization agenda as well. We've seen how the ideology has created a feministic outlook on things across the West because it's more emotional. Now, that's not no insult to any females watching. Males and females obviously can have different emotional states, but in a balanced society, generally, the masculinity comes from the males, the femininity comes from the females, and the ideology, in a sense, knows this. So it's in its interests, because Marxist brainwashing is emotion-based and about compassion, quote unquote, it's a good thing to put more gay men or females into positions of influence. They're more likely to go along with this agenda to push the ideology, as well as helping the oppressed groups that they belong to. So it all fits together pretty much.
Yeah, if they feel that they can get a benefit by promoting the ideology, then they're going to go ahead and do that. So you can see how they've co-opted all of these so-called minority groups. Women aren't a minority, but they're seen as like one of the historically oppressed groups. So they're going to capture them. Okay, great, fantastic. So what's the last thing I'll ask before we end out here is, what is there any political party in Ireland that you support that has a good platform, or that is fighting back against some of this stuff? Or what do you think is some solutions to the issue of the Marxist infiltration and cult going on here?
Well, I think the nationalist movement is growing. There's obviously plenty of independents, but in terms of the parties, you've got groups like the more prominent ones are the Irish Freedom Party, where Herman Kelly as the leader of that party. You've also got Ireland First down in the south, who's started up by Mr. Derek Bly. And then you've also got the National Party as well, which has had some leadership troubles, but James Reynolds and Justin Barrett are the leaders. And they've had some issues, but they've also elected someone recently. Patrick Quinlan in one of the Dublin constituencies is actually one of the people who got in, the bigger figures who got in from one of the major parties. So I think the movement is building. I'm not aligned to any one of those groups just yet, though I like some of the characters involved. I think they're pretty much on the right track. The big thing I will say, though, and this has to happen, but I don't know how, there has to be some sort of a coalition between the nationalist groups. And this has been one of the big talking points recently among the Irish patriotic crowd. But they have to find a way of finding a common ground, because they're up against such a big system that I think when you're up against the state, the NGO complex, the police force, the media, the entertainment industry, education, etc., we really need to have a unified force. I don't know how that's going to happen, but hopefully they'll find a way around this somehow.
Okay, fantastic. And do you advocate for young men to get involved in some groups, or what do you think should they do to fight back against all this stuff?
I think that there needs to be that physical element at some stage, and the problem is there's a lot of enthusiastic people who want to get involved, but they're probably not sure who they should align with. And again, joining forces is a priority. I think that Justin Barrett, who's the leader of the National Party, has set up a group called Clan Éireann, and I think he has that kind of view in mind. Another problem now with the Irish scene, there's a lot of infighting and a lot of the debate between the civic nationalists camp and that old chestnut, the ethno-nationalist camp. That's causing some division as well. So there's a lot of issues that need to be ironed out, and hopefully they get resolved, because obviously the clock is ticking here, really.
100%. And where can people buy your book? Can they get it in electronic format or just hard copy?
So the publisher for now is just doing their paperback version. So there's no audiobook or Kindle or anything just yet. So my website, resolvingor.com, has a page dedicated to the book. There's a bunch of links there where people can buy it. I would say people in Ireland or the UK or in Western Europe, they could just go straight to the publisher, Omnia Veritas. And also, but say people in America or in Canada are probably better off going to Amazon or one of the American distributors.
Fantastic. Yeah, I definitely am going to get a copy of that as soon as I can. Looks fantastic. You've done a lot of great work over the years, and it's good to see you're still out there fighting the good fight.
Thanks, Brandon.
And I think sometime down in the next few years, people need to start getting involved directly in politics in their community, or in their city, because a lot of people are just isolated in these online bubbles and groups and chats and stuff, and they're not doing too much in the real world. But it really is the real world stuff that we need to change. Online activism has kind of served its purpose throughout the Trump years and such, but it's kind of dying off a little bit. It's,
absolutely, yeah. Physical action is needed in the real world. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, where can people find you? It's Resolved Reality. Is that on X and other websites as well?
Yeah, so I actually lost. It's my own fault because I took such a long break. The old website was resolvingreality.com, but the new domain is resolvingor.com. So or for Romeo, resolvingor.com. And that has all the links there. I'm on YouTube as well if people want to find me there, Resolving Reality. And the handle on X is the same as the website, Resolving Or.
Fantastic. It's great to have you on, and we'll keep in touch. You can, of course, people listening, you can find me at Martinez Politix with an X on Telegram, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you all for listening. Take care.
Thanks, Brandon.